Thank you, Arctic Acoustic. I love the music.
Yeah, this is Harold Hansen adding a note from 2023. This episode is quite different from the episodes that there'll be in the future. Looking back on it from 3 years ago, I can't quite understand why I made the artistic choices I did. And I was tempted to replace them, but I'm going to leave them because, hey, that's where my mind was at the time in 2020. Just know this episode contains some unreliable narration about Philip II, some strange acting on my part and my guest, Raoul Sunset. We're trying to deal not only with the historical narrative of the First Spanish Armada, but of Paul Johnson's concept of British racism as one of their primary supports in the great Elizabethan battle against Spain. So, with that said, any questions or comments, send them to hangingwithhistorypodcast@gmail.com.
Okay, welcome back to Hanging with History, Season 1, That Miracle That Happened. That One Time. This is Episode 15, The Spanish Armada versus God's Chosen People. And a little bit later, we're going to be joined by Raoul Sunset. He's one of the world's leading experts in a money issue that most people don't even know exists. And he's a really good friend. It's 1588, and it's time for the bout of the century. The reigning world champion Spain against an upstart challenger England. It's rare to see a heavyweight fighter get into the ring with a flyweight, but that's the bout we have today, folks. In the ring for Spain, we have 130 ships with 24,000 sailors and soldiers. In the English corner, there are about 4,000 militia, gathered in a field to defend London, and lots of small ships. None of that fantastic punching power we see in the Spanish corner. The Spanish coach is an old, experienced boxing hand. What's that? Not experienced at all? He's heard of boxing. The English corner has some of the greatest trainers and coaches of all time. Okay, we'll drop the boxing metaphor here. Flyweights don't fight heavyweights, no matter how well coached. But in history, Finland held off the Soviet Union in the winter of 1939 and 40. They had to sign a peace, but Khrushchev said they gained just enough territory to bury their dead. Probably around 250,000. Yeah, in fact, the Finns were worried that when the spring thaw came, all those dead bodies would cause a cholera epidemic that they couldn't deal with. And so, if you can kill the enemy at a rate of more than 10-1 to your own losses, well, we saw the Dutch defeat Spain, and we know the 13 colonies defeated the superpower, Great Britain. Greeks against Persians, Vikings against everyone, the Knights Hospitaller defending Rhodes, and then Malta against the Ottomans, and then, very weirdly, having something like the world's 8th largest air force for a couple years after World War II, technically, but that's off topic. The Portuguese in India. There are more. Military history actually has a lot of examples of flyweights beating heavyweights, and military history is endlessly fascinating. An obsession of mine for a couple of decades. The year 1600 is a good time to check back in with human progress in England. It's right around the time of the Spanish Armada in 1588, the first of 3 Spanish armadas intended to conquer England. The first thing to acknowledge is that England is dominated by agriculture at this time, the same way as the United Provinces, that's the Dutch, are dominated by trade and the sea. It's a bit different than we would say of any other European country dominated by agriculture. The English have unusually good access to meat. Livestock is 30 to 50% of agricultural output, with wool and broadcloth 80% of exports. We're just about to get colonies in North America. Chesapeake Bay first, and then the Pilgrims taking their extremist religious act on the road, first to Leiden, an intellectual center of Calvinist Reformed religion in the United Provinces, and then to Plymouth, Massachusetts. The nature of the settlement in the colonies, its underlying pattern, is that of an agricultural society. Everyone wants land for themselves to farm. The Pilgrims did experiment with primitive communism, starry-eyed idealists that they were. The communal approach fails. They are going to die. So they turn to private farming. When ideology fails, This is what they can relate to as a practical solution to save their lives. The Chesapeake settlement around Jamestown seems like a hellscape. Too far south, too many mosquitoes, too much death, yet somehow they succeed and prosper. And you will note that the Dutch in New York ended up with a trading city that fails to expand as a farming settlement, despite many advantages. They focused on trade and town life. Very Dutch of them. What could be more influential upon the eventual shape of our world? But we'll go back to that. It could all still have been wrecked. Philip II was just the man to wreck it. Spain was rich, but it was hollowing out, its middle class shrinking, and not upwardly, as perhaps we see today, but very much downwardly. Somehow the hyper-competence of the Spanish in the first half of the 16th century was gone, replaced by furious religious dogmatism, the Counter-Reformation. I'm reminded of Rossowski's comment about fighting the Germans in the 20th century, referring to World War II, I and II here. We fought the fathers and we fought the sons, and the fathers were the better men. Something like that. A generational shift happened to Spain. Once the mightiest warrior culture, now still very strong, but the invincible edge is gone. And by the way, Storm is here in the recording studio with me, so if you can hear a dragon snoring in the background, that's what that is. Spain couldn't deal with the Dutch revolt, as we saw in the last episode. Any society could fail against a phenomenon like the Dutch. Military geniuses have a way of overturning established order, and Maurice of Nassau was one of those. And the human energy of Reformed religion, well, it just seems irresistible. That certainty, the combination of the doctrine of the elect with the notion of a calling. You are saved by your calling, but not for it. You can only show the other monkeys that you are elect, and therefore the highest status, by hard work, dedication, and success. Nothing could be better calculated to concentrate the mind and spirit on the practical. It's really hard to fight, and we can have a perspective like that. But Philip II didn't have our knowledge. England was an apostate country, and the penalty for apostasy is death. It's that simple. No, of course it isn't that simple. Philip was married to Mary Tudor, known as Bloody Mary. Say her name 3 times in a mirror. And Philip didn't think she was nearly bloody enough. If you look at a map of the United Provinces, it seems like just a small fringe on the coast. How could that resist the might of Spain? Well, one reason, from Philip's perspective, was that England provided strategic depth. The sea beggars were based there. The refugee problem, and Philip was good at creating Dutch refugees, could have overwhelmed the United Provinces. But the refugees just seemed to make them stronger. One reason was that the overflow ended up in England. William Cecil, one of Elizabeth's advisors, and she had a galaxy of brilliant men around her, encouraged the refugees to come to England. He wanted them to develop a textile industry. It's pretty nice to get refugees that raise the average intellectual competence and skills of your country. Imagine that. And England was getting that with their Dutch refugees. And the Dutch revolt was stimulating English shipbuilding. Stimulating English shipbuilding. That sounds important. From Philip's perspective, he had every reason to crush England. Strategically, this would make the Dutch position impossible. Personally, he had grudges to settle from his time there as Mary's consort. Ideologically, they were Protestants, and hell, even the English Catholics tended to see their church as superior to Rome. Economically, piracy was bleeding Spain. Ending the Dutch War would solve a lot of problems. Philip had every reason to think that that would get him back his richest possessions. And we know he needed the money. And we know the Armada failed. We know that war with Spain electrified England. We know that England was becoming a sea power. But Philip would have known different things, like the limitations of the Tudor state, the weaknesses of the English navy. Elizabeth was collecting less tax than ever in real terms. I think it ended up like 40% less per year at the end versus the start of her reign, mainly due to inflation. She managed, she got by selling royal lands, of which her father, Henry VIII, had acquired a great deal by the expedience of taking church land during the Reformation. Philip would have known of this and sensed weakness the way a shark smells blood in the water, and he understood the English Navy. He even improved it a good deal back when he was the King of England. What? Philip was King of England? Yeah, he was married to Mary Tudor, as we said, and a few of the English ships were really quite good, thanks to Philip's reforms. But the Navy was small potatoes still. The Armada was 130 ships, supported by many more, plenty enough to crush the English fleet. Philip appointed one of the top dukes to command it, the Duke of Medina Sidonia. The fact that he had no naval warfare experience didn't matter. Actually, that sort of thing matters a lot. And we'll talk about the fact that the English and Dutch elites tended to be highly competent people who proved they could successfully do things, while the Spanish, and later England's next rival, France, had elites who were just well born. By the way, many historians dislike my way of looking at things here. I think many of them would be cringing about now. Judged on their own terms at the time, the Duke of Medina Sidonia was an excellent choice. It's often the right way to see things, but here at Hanging with History, we have a lens. That miracle that happened. That one time. So that's how we roll. Did your choices lead to the miracle? No? Then bad choice. Should have chosen differently. Did your choice possibly work toward the miracle? Then good choice. It matters because the Armada, once it set sail, made mistake after mistake from a naval perspective. In their first engagements, they let the English take advantage of speed and maneuverability to whittle them down and lower their morale without inflicting any losses on the English. And who were the English commanded by? Howard and Francis Drake, the same Francis Drake, love his name, who had recently sailed around the world and had already made a career out of beating the Spanish at sea. You have ships, great wooden vessels powered by sails which could bear the weight of many cannon, which fired cannonballs which could kill men and sink ships eventually. 50 years later, they'd be better at this as naval gun technology improved. The Spanish had the most ships and the biggest, with large supplies of cannon and shot. And so what stupidity did the Spanish commit? They would make it very hard for their ships to actually fire many shots by crowding the decks with supplies and focus on trying to board the English ships. Gulp. Yes. This had worked at Lepanto against the Turks, but the English didn't want to get boarded, so they didn't. They just sailed around not getting boarded. In every engagement, the English did something clever, like weaken the Armada with fire ships. Sneak in close to fire broadsides near enough to hole Spanish hulls. The Spanish were just large and ineffectual. The English could do no more than nibble at their numbers, really. The technological edge they had was way too small. But the edge in leadership. When the Spanish fled after the Battle of Gravelines, they fled north, pursued by Howard. Although he was almost out of ammunition, it was a grand bluff. One of history's great bluffs. Falling for the bluff was just one in a long string of leadership failures from the Great Duke, a man of superior blood. By now, I suppose you can sense I'm impatient with notions of nobility and breeding, but more on that later. Instead of going back south and trying again, the Armada sailed all the way round Scotland and the west coast of Ireland. Up till now, losses had been relatively light, but the long voyaging, battle damage, and dwindling ship repair supplies made them vulnerable, when God himself intervened in human affairs and sent the Spanish a storm. Nonetheless, 2/3 to 3/4 of the Armada made it home. It was an expensive loss, so expensive it would have ruined many treasuries, but Spain just tried again. 8 years later, they gathered another great armada, only to see God's finger strike it down with fire from the sky, towering seas, and gusts that rolled ships over before they even left Spanish waters. And Spain went bankrupt again. They tried for a third time. The next year, in 1597, with 140 ships, and God put his finger on the scales again. More fire from the skies, more swallowing seas, another failure. And this seems to be as good a time as any to introduce the English as God's chosen people. God's favor is shown by direct divine intervention against the Spanish. Culturally, God had given Shakespeare to the world through England and introduced the welfare state via the parish, so that England became the first to follow Christ's teachings on charity.
What? Have you gone mad?
No, Raoul Sunset, not really. This bit I can't even keep going as long as the boxing metaphor. But we will have to face the fact that the English considered themselves God's chosen. Enough of them did to matter anyway.
That was the Jews. Abraham, the All-Father, sometimes called Abraham, made a covenant with God, exchanging exclusive worship for protection.
Well, first off, Odin is the All-Father, and God making a simple reciprocal trade doesn't make sense.
No, All-Father is simply what Abraham means in Hebrew. He is the father of Israel and of the Jews and of the Arabs.
Oh yeah, but the exchange of worship for protection?
That's a very deep idea, introducing reciprocity, interaction via reason, a purpose for history and the future of humanity, plus a direct, lasting relationship with God. I would have thought you would be aware of these things.
Oh, I was distracted by the subject of how the English got to regard themselves as God's chosen people. I mean, they had the Old Testament. They even read it for themselves now. English Bible and all that, Wycliffe and Tyndale. They knew the Jews were God's chosen, but somehow they began to think of themselves in that role. I mean, it sure was useful. When you think of how difficult it would be to buck the tides of intellectual and economic history, then reverse them to overthrow the first great power, Spain, and the next great power, France, to throttle back on the ideology of divine monarchy, and then to actually throttle it. And then for a tiny number of people to dominate world trade, lead in technology, industry, manufacturing, mining, culture, and spread out all over the world, and again dominate it in language, culture, and power, well-being, kindness, and charity.
Yeah, I wouldn't call the British Empire kindness and charity, although Canada does exist.
Nobody would. That's not my point, although Canada exists. I'm talking about something else.
Why do you have to be so obscure then?
I'm talking about how useful it is to see yourself as better than everyone else when you want to do something great. Could there be a virtuous cycle here also? Historians, a lot of military historians, like to say that the Spanish Armada didn't settle anything. This seems like another example of historians who miss the point. As an example, there are historians who say that the Battle of Jutland in 1916 didn't settle anything. Well, it's the wrong lens. The English won World War I, the naval part anyway, on the day the war started. The only thing they could do was throw away their victory. And they didn't. So the Brits win, despite that it appears the Germans outperformed the English that particular day. The Armada case is only a little different. The Spanish could have had a decisive victory. For Elizabethan England, no decisive victory is kind of the point. That is the win. Good enough. More than good enough. 3 failed armadas. 3. That's the miracle. The dead hand of the Roman, medieval, noble-dominated past was reaching out to England, which is the future, with a Mike Tyson punch, a mailed fist, a grand invasion army, or whatever metaphor you like. Well, wait, one of those isn't a metaphor. And they were reaching out to immolate the baby of Reformation, of thinking for yourself, with the fires of the Inquisition. And certainly they should have been able to do it. If they had defeated the English fleet and landed their forces, installed a Roman sympathizing ruler, who knows what the future would have been like. that all three armadas failed was a miracle.
That does not mean divine intervention in human affairs in this case.
Oh, sure. It was aliens.
Dude, seriously, no.
A eucatastrophe, then. We are back to episode 1. There is some indication it was all George Foxe's idea. His Book of Martyrs was a bestseller in most literate homes, in every parish church, and many people's first exposure to history. It's been asserted by historians of the time that many of Elizabeth's pirates accepted Foxe's words as literal truth. Drake carried a copy with him when he was sailing around the world, a little light reading under the southern skies where stars are strange. He's known to have read out many contentious passages to his Spanish prisoners. Yeah, you might think that's torture. Anyway, after his victory at Cadiz, almost his first act was to write Foxe, thanking him for his prayers. So what's this about Foxe and martyrs? Well, William Haller wrote a great book called Foxe's Martyr and the Elect Nation that lays out this phenomenon pretty well. There had to be prepared ground for this to work. That's one reason I wouldn't back off on the Joseph of Arimathea stuff in episode 4. Their religion was different, insular, if not superior. And during the Middle Ages, personal standards were different and felt to be different from the continent. The Templars' example in episode 12 shows that. The reaction to the Black Death could not have been more different. Remember in episode 10 we talked about the content of your toolbox? It shows the English toolbox was different. You may not agree that something small and modest, but very determined, in a hobbit-like way, came out of the Danelaw. Let me quote John Aylmer from this time. God is English. God has brought forth in me the greatest and excellentest treasure that he hath for your comfort in all the worlds. He that out of my womb should come that servant of Christ John Wycliffe, who begat Huss, who begat Luther, who begat truth. Foxe demonstrated to his readers that England won out over God's enemies not by the quality of their rulers, although he did sing the praises of Elizabeth as Deborah, but by the willingness of all classes and sexes to unite against tyranny. The one essential test of God's people was willingness of all classes to rebel against tyranny. He exalted working-class martyrs and women as they resisted Bloody Mary's oppression. Religion, thus understood, acted as a leveler of classes and sex in a way that just wasn't true elsewhere. It called for tolerance and unity. That is just going to help you get the best out of the people. One quote, "If there cannot be an end to our disputations and contending one against another, yet let there be a moderation in our affections, because God has so placed us Englishmen, here in one commonwealth, also in one church, as in one ship together. Let us not mangle and divide the ship, which being divided perisheth. But every man serve his order with diligence wherein he is called." If it's true that the English weren't all that religious in the main, then there was nationalism, or something like it, like a pro-English racism. That quote sounds just like Pericles uniting the Athenians against the Persians. For American listeners, it sounds like Lincoln uniting the North. And people could unite around the importance of education. Foxe referred to each printing press as a blockhouse against St. Angelo. You run into this idea everywhere. Here's the most straightforward assertion of it I know, from John Davies. Listen to the wording, it's astonishing. "Are not we only set upon Mount Zion to give light unto the world? Have we not the true handmaid of the Lord to rule us? It is only we, therefore, that must be the shining messengers of the Lord, and none but we." Very exclusive. None but we. Are not we only? And this attitude is kind of at odds with the increasing intellectual sophistication of the time. I mean, what else is going on? Shakespeare, Francis Bacon. Religion did not move everyone. But this is the kind of myth that moves the heart and mind. We are a superior kind of people. That doesn't require religious belief. There is some facet of the idea that is seductive to almost all. English sailors, as encountered in Patrick O'Brien's books, believed in their superiority explicitly, but then O'Brien either knew his holler or they shared sources more likely. I sort of feel like this notion of superiority was better understood a couple generations ago, where our focus on racism in the last few decades has obscured that aspect of it. One hint of this comes from the English comedy Dudley Moore Peter Cook version of Bedazzled in 1967. The devil is trying to seduce a fry cook.
He moves in a very mysterious way, you know.
But, I mean, apart from the way he moves, what's God really like? I mean, what colour is he?
He's all colours of the rainbow, many-hued.
But he is English, isn't he?
Oh, yes, very upper class.
And the cook nods. Obviously, that's how the universe is. God is an upper-class Briton, even for people who don't much believe in God.
What about charity and kindness?
What about charity and kindness? This is a history podcast. When has there ever been charity and kindness?
You brought it up earlier in the episode.
Oh, yes, so I did.
It seemed important.
It's one of the most important things there is. Social monkeys need to signal it, or you collapse into the problem of evil. There's a lot to say about charity and kindness in the Elizabethan era, and we will have to deal with evil. It is a problem. Let's talk about it next week. For now, stay away from evil. Treat it like a lump of polonium, okay?
And I've stopped asking for people to leave positive reviews on iTunes, and people have stopped leaving reviews. So please, go leave a positive review on iTunes today. Thanks. It's really very helpful to the podcast, and it helps people find the podcast.
Okay, we'll figure it out.
Hey, Camie, welcome back to Hanging with History. Nice to have you back on the program on this very hot day and a very long heat wave. And you just had a chance to listen to episode 15, so what'd you think?
Well, a couple of questions. You started talking about Philip, who was married to Mary Tudor, known as Bloody Mary, but he didn't think she was bloody enough. Did I miss something? You kind of dropped that story. It felt like.
Yeah, that's going to come along. Mary was a Catholic, a Roman Catholic. A lot of even the Protestants in England refer to themselves as Catholics. Yeah, she was a believer in the supremacy of the papacy, and when she succeeded her younger brother as queen and went and got married to Philip of Spain, she started a religious terror, and we call it the Marian persecution sometimes, and she gets the name of Bloody Mary, and Foxe wrote his very influential book all about the persecution, the pro-Catholic, anti-Protestant persecution under Mary and Philip.
See, I wasn't quite sure where Bloody Mary came from. Tomato juice, and I mean, I've heard Bloody Mary, but I wasn't sure where that came from. And
Yeah, I tossed in a lot of odd references to other writers and other bits of history, and kind of assumed that most of my listeners are going to know what that refers to, but it's probably not always true.
the other thought I had was the superior people, the armies that go into battle believing that God is on their side, kind of the onward Christian soldiers kind of attitude in a way. That song just popped into my head. I'm sorry, I know that's not what that was written about.
Right.
We're going to win this battle, kind of. We see that throughout history. I mean, did the Spanish not have that strong belief that they were in the right in some way?
I think they had lost their edge. I think they came out of the Reconquista in the 1490s with a great deal of self-confidence and belief in themselves, strong enough that they basically carried out their own Reformation. People refer to it as the Iberian Reformation, where they got rid of most of the abuses of the church and just settled everything up really reasonably, and they were kind of invincible for a long time. But then, I put in that Rosikowski quote to illustrate that, they were not the same people that their fathers and grandfathers were by this time.
Weren't the same people, but how did they lose that edge? What do you think?
Tend to blame it on the centralizing tendencies of the Spanish monarchy, which is due to local politics, which became terribly intolerant and ended up resulting in the expulsion of the Jews, the expulsion of the Moors, and a kind of religious conformity where they basically forced everybody to convert to their brand of Catholicism. And a lot of the political pressure locally in Spain derived from the fact that Moorish slavers were continuing to raid their country, like crazy. And there were many raids where thousands of people were taken as slaves away to North Africa. It would wreck the politics of almost any country. You get paranoid, afraid of spies everywhere, and that's what was going on in Spain. This terrible pressure from having their people taken as slaves by, Moorish Islamic slavers. It might have seemed crazy to the people in the Spanish army and the Spanish Armada to go off and fight for Habsburg dynastic interests when they had this problem to deal with at home.
Yeah, I could see that would take away anybody's edge. Maybe not their anger, but their edge.
Yeah. So, they were successful in fighting the Moors. They beat the Turks at the Battle of Lepanto. They conquered a lot of enclaves in North Africa, trying to combat this whole slave raiding thing, which was just very influential on their politics and therefore their history.
And thanks, Raoul, for coming on the program. It was great to have you.